Yes. You can just go ahead.
Yes, sir.
Okay, right. So let's get started. Uh, Good day to everybody, and welcome to the 2020 virtual edition of APSIG Day 1. We already had a Day 0 of interactions. This is the formal start of the event. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to the first virtual edition of APSIG. APSIG was founded in 2015 and started with the annual event from 2016. And this edition is also the first organized by the elected leadership of APSIG. And at the outset, I'd like to thank everyone who helped us to organize this event. Our advisory council members, Professor Kilnam Chon, who is the founder of APSIG, Ms. Shita Lakshmi and Leonid Todorov provided inputs that enable us to visualize this edition. The APSIG Executive Committee, as well as the Program Committee and Fellowship Committee, shouldered most of the work. Our supporters, APASA, ICANN, Internet Society, .asia, APNIC, Article 19, and the Public Interest Registry provided us with the confidence to forge ahead. And we acknowledge their kind support and note that particularly APNIC and .asia work very closely with us meaning the organizing team, to put together this program. And we have volunteers from both these organizations with us, helping out in various ways. APSIG 2020 was initially planned as a face-to-face meeting and co-located with the APR IGF 2020 at Kathmandu. And I'd also like to thank the APR IGF community for their support to us. I'd also like to record that several national SIGs have been conducted very successfully this year, despite the global pandemic, and I'd like to congratulate all of them. Now, APSIG, we have tried to position APSIG as an intermediate level school on internet governance. The global pandemic has kind of abundantly demonstrated how important the internet is today, and it is set to become even more important as we go forward, perhaps even after the pandemic has been brought under control. Given that the internet is a universally used infrastructure, all stakeholders need to be involved in its governance. Regional schools such as APSIG provide a means of training at the intermediate level that enables practitioners to better participate in these global processes. Even more important, fellows become part of the internet governance community, which makes it possible to surmount the usual barriers. We have things like time zones, language, culture, etc. By joining a community, some of those barriers become less formidable. APSIG, in particular, also tries to provide a platform for the national SIGs to come together in the form of its all-SIG group. We are happy to report that we had a good response to the fellowship call. We have 65 fellows from 24 countries who have been shortlisted. Perhaps not all of them are currently on the call, but I'm sure they will join. And Mubashir, who headed the fellowship committee, will talk to us briefly after I finish. And we also have tried to create a program structure that includes both global and regional topics, drawn from the traditional internet governance domain, which includes names, numbers, and so on, as well as emerging technologies and social aspects like diversity, gender, etc. Dr. Govind, who heads the program committee, will outline the program after I finish speaking. As a virtual edition, there are some constraints that we face. Usually, it's a time zone which is the biggest problem. Another for us is the severe shortage of time, because we have compressed this program, especially for participant interaction. And for APSIG, the participant interaction has been part of the learning process, and it is something that we regret that we have had to cut down on. So, if required, we will consider, taking up additional sessions after these 3 days are over, if there is an interest from the participants. Now, the group of fellows this year have several senior participants who themselves have organized internet governance events and even schools on internet governance SIGs. We also have a number of new people, and I'm sure that APSIG will considerably enrich your lives, not just over these 3 days, but even later when you're part of the APSIG community. I hope that you will gain from this experience and that you utilize this opportunity. and that you enrich yourself first and then your own communities later. I'd like to wish you all the best ahead. And I'd like to now request Dr. Govind and Mubashir to speak to us briefly over the next 5 minutes. Dr. Govind, please.
Thank you, Satish Babu, and very good day to all of you. Especially, I would like to welcome Professor Kilnam Chon, who is the founder of APSIG, and Anriette, who is the chair of the Global IGF, who has successfully conducted this IGF in a virtual edition. So coming as Professor Satish Babu has already briefed about the history of APSIG and other details, I will go into mainly the program, like why overview of the APSIG is there are many regional SIGs like European SIGs, Middle East SIG, North American SIG. Similarly, this is the Asia Pacific SIG catering to the needs of the Asia Pacific community. Asia Pacific School on Internet Governance intends to serve internet governance experts, leaders in Asia Pacific for their professional upgrade and collaborations. They may, and there are national SIGs, so they can collaborate with the national SIGs, like there is a Pakistan SIG, Bangladesh SIG, India SIG, and other SIGs in Brazil and other countries. Coming to the sessions, this year it was a big challenge to interact and make the sessions more interactive, because this is not a face-to-face meeting this year, so virtual edition. So there were the big challenges coming, what kind of session topics we should choose, whether it should be a capacity building model or the interactive model like in forums. So what we decided was, if we make it more as classroom type, then it will be very boring. So we made it more interactive this year. In each session, there are 2 to 3 speakers. Some sessions are quite breakout rooms have been made so that participants can be fully engaged with the speakers and Q&A can be done very lively way. So starting after this inaugural session, there is Professor Kilnam Chon is going to speak, who is the founder of APSIG, and Anriette, who would be speaking on the future of IGF based on this year's IGF held in Germany. So next is going to be the session on internet landscape, and that will be done by the Jaisi Chen and managed by APNIC, Sunny and others, Pablo. And that session will be doing the things like how the internet governance is taking place. Then there will be artificial intelligence, smart cities, and human rights session. Then access, gender, and digital divide. Then there will be a social media governance, data and content, how the moderation of that going to be taking place. Then there will be a diversity and disability session, and one more session on digital economy, and followed by cyber security session where the end user perspective will be done. So these are the, in nutshell, the basic tenets of this 3 days sessions on APSIG, where expert speakers are going to talk about in an interactive manner with the participants. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Govind. Over to you, Bashir.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is Mubashir. I'm currently volunteering for Executive Committee as Vice Chair, and also volunteering as Fellowship Committee Chair. I, along with my committee members, we tried our best to evaluate the applications received based on the criteria like the prior experience and interest to participate in this edition of APSIG 2020. And we tried our best to come up with a good number of fellows for this year. And we encourage you all to participate actively so that you should be given priority or preference in your application for next year edition. Hopefully we will be having a face-to-face edition next year. And lastly, I will just share a couple of information. This session is being recorded, and we are also streaming it privately on YouTube. That will be available after the end of the session. And we will share the links with the participants. And these are a few contact details you can just use for your reference. Let me just show you. Note down these contact details. You can just approach Chair Satish Babu if you have any query or you have any complaint or suggestion. And you can also contact our secretary, Shruti Priyamaji, and his email address and WhatsApp number is given. Thank you, everyone. I hope you will enjoy upcoming sessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mubashir. And we now move on to our next speaker. This is Professor Kilnam Chon, who's a veteran in internet governance in the region and the founder of APSIG. Can we please have his slides online, please? Professor Chon will be speaking to us on his vision for APSIG. Over to you, Professor Chon.
Just can you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can see it on the screen now.
Okay. So you can see my PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay. Good to see you, all of you. It took quite a while, and it's a very different those arrangement. Let me talk on new normal or the next phase of APSIG. Probably maybe a good time to talk. Can I come to the next page? Okay, new normal or next phase of APSIG. APSIG is in around 5 years. So now I guess we have to think about what's the objective of APSIG in the next 5 to 10 years. Because everything around the APSIG and the national SIG are changing dramatically. It's almost a revolution. For example, take a look at our 2020 IGF tracks. We have 4: data, environment, inclusion, and trust. There's so much change on what the IGF covers 10 years ago and today. Then the issue or challenge is, are we going to cover those data, environment, inclusion, and trust? And how about those national SIGs? They cover those, as well as introduction to the internet, like IP address, domain names. And this would give a pressure to the APSIG participant, or in the other word, national SIGs leaders. And not just in this content, also the online participation. IGF finally embracing online participation as much as on-site participation now, partly due to coronavirus. And probably next year may be same. Then this whole pattern on a participation will change. How does it change? Now, anybody can attend any meeting anywhere in the world. What would you do? We used to have do you remember APSIG and the national SIG? We used to have a tremendous pressure. How to send the people to the IGF? Expensive, first of all, it's very expensive. And also submitting a workshop proposal is not easy. And those constraints are changing now. So how do we do it? Do we spend all our resources for those national SIG leaders to attend the IGF and also the regular participant to the IGF? Or what about the regional SIGs? Well, if you go by the top down, just simply, if you are interested in a global issue, then try to attend the IGF, which is a global. If you are interested in the regional issues, then go to the regional IGF, like APR IGF, or there are many more regional IGFs in the world. And if you are interested in the national SIGs, then if you're interested in those, then just prepare for the national SIGs. So now we have to think, what's the role of APSIG and the national SIGs and their leaders? Can I go to the next page? Okay, APSIG in 2020s. I hope this new management to come up with a good proposal this year and the next year, and I hope you could implement probably by end of next year's. First of all, I guess we have to think about the support. How do we support the participation to the IGF? And which is it's pretty good now. It's a very good program and a very nice way to participate. But participation IGF is you need a lot. You have to prepare a lot. So shall we give a more training to attend the IGF, or the equally other meetings, national SIGs meeting, national IGF meeting, and regional national meeting? This is something you have to prepare, as I'm repeating. And then next is the relationship between the APSIG and the national SIGs. When we start back in 5 years ago, you remember PK SIG was brand new, and India SIG, Satish and others are preparing, and Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, no, they are not ready. Now they are matured, pre-matured. So the APSIG's role should change. Are we still doing it as a facilitation? Or what's the role? And what's the relationship between the APSIG and the national SIGs? And we have to give a good thought. What's the best way? And so through those proposal and trial implementation and the final proposal, I hope APSIG to develop a new normal in a timely manner. So that's the message. And if I can be of any help, let me know. Challenging those whole new environment on internet governance and the school of internet governance around us and in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Chon, for sharing your thoughts on this very important aspect, how in the new normal we have to reinvent ourselves. So there are, of course, many challenges, but there are also several opportunities that the new normal brings with it. But you're right, we need to kind of consider how this is going to impact us for the future. Thanks very much, and we'll of course be in touch with you as an advisor to figure out how best we can respond to these situations. Thank you once again. And with that, Chon has repeatedly mentioned IGF. We are of course very fortunate to have amongst us the IGF MAG chair, the chair of the multi-stakeholder advisory group, Anriette Esterhuysen, with us. And I'd like to thank Anriette for her support to us by agreeing to speak to us. Anriette will speak for about 15 minutes and then take a few questions. So please prepare your questions. Over to you, Anriette.
Thank you very much, Satish, and greetings to everyone. I'm talking to you from Johannesburg. And yes, I am currently the chair of the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group of the IGF. And it's a real honor to be here. And it's an honor to talk after Professor Chon. Kilnam is one of my mentors. And I'm very honored to be in the Internet Hall of Fame with him. So very, very pleased to be here. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you briefly about the IGF itself and try and point the participants in this year's APSIG to where you can follow the outcomes of this year's IGF. And then I'll focus a bit more on what Satish asked me to talk about, which is the future. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's just do this. I'm going to take you to the IGF. Just hang on a little bit here. And please, everyone, do put up your hands if you want to ask questions. Sorry, I'm just getting the screen share ready. Apologies that it's taking me so long. Here it is. Okay, so this is just to give you a little bit of a sense of the IGF by numbers this year. Can you all see that?
Yes.
This document I'm showing you now. If you go to the IGF website, you will find it under IGF outputs. But just to give you a quick snapshot of this, IGF 2020 took place virtually, as you know, because of the pandemic, and it took place over 12 days. And we tried to do it in different time zones to include as many people as possible. We were not Asia friendly enough, and that is something I admit straight off. But look at the participation numbers. We had 6,136 registrations and more than ever before countries. We had people from 173 countries. And also the participation by stakeholder group is interesting. If you look, 16.5% governments, civil society, nearly 40%, that's normal. Technical community, 15.2%, private sector, 18%. So we were able to be quite inclusive. Regional participation, I don't have with me at the moment, but that also looks pretty good. But now I want to take you to outputs. So, and this relates to the future of the IGF as well. How do we get the IGF to generate more outputs? As you'll see, what we did this year was to try and produce IGF messages. Now, messages are in a sense code for recommendations. They are less than recommendations. Those of you that have been at APSIG before will know this, and you'll probably discover this. There's a lot of debate in the multi-stakeholder internet governance sector about whether multi-stakeholder processes, such as the global IGF or national and regional IGFs, should be making policy recommendations or not. Usually at national and regional level, there's much more readiness, much more openness to make policy recommendations. But at the global level, it is very political and it's very contested, because there are some stakeholders from government who would say that multi-stakeholder processes shouldn't be making policy. They can discuss policy, but they can't make policy recommendations. And then there are other stakeholders, often also from governments, who say, but what is the point of having a talk shop if you don't actually come up with policy recommendations? And the way in which we are trying to deal with that is by coming up with messages. So if you look at the IGF outputs, you'll see that there are different types of levels of messages and outcomes. There are messages from the high-level leaders tracks, and then there are messages according to the thematic tracks. And I'll just see if I can pull out one of those thematic track messages. I'm having a bit of a Zoom problem here with sharing my desktop, so I'm not being very successful with that. So here is an example of I'll give you a track messages. If you look at, Professor Chon mentioned the themes. Here you can look at, for example, data. And this is where we begin to try and capture what can be used by policymakers. And this, I think, is key to the future of the IGF. How do we bring this diverse group of people from all stakeholder groups together from all over the world, but actually influence policy making? And this is how we're trying to do it. If you can see this on screen at the moment, you'll see that there is overarching policy questions in the data theme. So one of the questions, and I'm just mentioning this as an example, was what policies and concrete actions are needed to ensure that data collection and use can benefit all, including those in developing countries, marginalized communities, and the unconnected. And then there are policy responses. They're not quite recommendations, but they're getting there. Such as, I look at the second bullet, for example, significant efforts are needed to provide wider, more inclusive data sets and to take active measures to counter bias by those who gather, process, and use data. So this is actually fairly broad, but can you begin to imagine how that, as a recommendation or a message, is something that can actually then be discussed by people who design the technology, by people who make the policy, by people who use the data sets to assess whether they are designed in an inclusive way. And I think that is really where we are trying to get with the IGF, to capture some of these concerns that people feel quite widely, quite broadly, where there's general consensus on these concerns from the technical community, from business, from civil society, even from government, and capture them in such a way that they are more concise and that they can be used by let's say there's a national government process. India at the moment is looking at non-personal data, for example. So the idea here would be that the Indian process looking at non-personal data can look at what the IGF produced with regard to data from its data track, because that content that comes out of the IGF data track is really generated bottom up. It comes out of all the workshops, all the sessions. And then it creates something that we feel actual policy making institutions and processes should and can consider. So that's more or less how the IGF worked. And if you look at the outputs page, you'll find that there's, for data, for environment, for inclusion, and for trust, there are similar sets of documents that captures the questions, the key questions, and some of the responses that emerge from the process. But let me jump to what I wanted to talk to you about. And I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen because you don't really need to see this. And this is, let me just stop share here. I wish the Linux Zoom interface would improve. Okay, good. So talking about the future, and I think the pandemic, you know, that's one of the values of the pandemic, is that it is forcing us to think about the future. And I want to talk about the following key points. Sorry, I am just struggling to get the right document in front of me here. Great. Firstly, I want to talk about the scope. Satish, just interrupt me if people can't follow me, okay?
No problem, please go ahead.
I think a challenge, and it's a challenge for APSIG and for other schools of internet governance, is going to be the scope of internet governance, because the internet governance is no longer just about the internet, not in a narrow way. There's so much, the policy challenges involve the use and abuse of the internet. It involves technology such as artificial intelligence, you know, which is separate from the internet, but it impacts on how the internet is run and business models on the internet. So that makes it a challenge. I think the other challenge for the multi-stakeholder process is, what is the status of this multi-stakeholder process? Where is the power? Is there still critical mass of support for the idea that the internet should be managed in a multi-stakeholder way. People say it should be, and I think we all are part of that. But at so many other levels, you see initiatives where powerful US companies, for example, go to the US Congress and say to them, regulate us. This is how you want us to regulate us. So I think there's also a need to look at how can we really consolidate the multi-stakeholder process as something that is influential and that is bottom-up, that looks at regulation. There is a need for regulation on the internet, but how can that regulation be made in a way that doesn't harm the internet and that is inclusive? And then I think the other real challenge ahead is around the digital cooperation architecture and the evolution of that. You will probably hear more in the next few days about the UN Secretary General's roadmap on digital cooperation, which is a fantastic challenge and opportunity. I can post the URL in the chat a little bit later. It's a new initiative to look at digital cooperation in 8 different areas, from connectivity to security to inclusion to capacity development. And one of those 8 areas is also the digital commons. And I think that's very exciting as well, because it brings up the idea of, I think it can open again the conversation about the internet as a public good, the internet as a commons that everyone should have access to. But I think the challenge here is that those of us that are involved in multi-stakeholder internet governance processes like IGFs is that we need to evolve. We need to be part of this new, fairly top-down cooperation process. We need to be willing to change and evolve, but we also should not lose what we've achieved in terms of bottom-up process. And I think that is a challenge. And that's why it's so important that schools like yours continuously widen the circle, that you bring more people into the process so that we can respond as a global collective from the global south and the global north to these new challenges and opportunities for digital cooperation, which also includes internet governance. So sorry, that was a bit of a mix of issues and topics, but I'll stop here and respond to questions in the time that is left.
Thanks very much, Anriette. So we will open the floor for questions. As people are thinking about their questions, I have a question. We have been hearing about IGF Plus. So is it the same as digital cooperation, or is it some subset of it? Can you tell us what is this IGF Plus?
Thanks, Satish. So let me start from the beginning. A few years ago, the UN Secretary convened something called the High-Level Panel on Digital Cooperation. This was very much, I think, in part in a response to the fact that there was just not sufficient connection between the SDG process, the Sustainable Development process of the United Nations, and internet-related processes. There was also a sense of governments that they weren't involved enough. This high-level panel produced a report on digital cooperation. And the next incarnation of that was published in June this year. And that's what's important. You should all note this document and look at it. And that is the UN Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation. And it outlines these 8 areas that I mentioned earlier, and one of them is the architecture of digital cooperation, and that is where IGF Plus falls. IGF Plus was first mentioned in the report of the high-level panel, but the roadmap is the newer incarnation of that, and it gives less detail, but on the other hand, it also commits that the UN Secretary General wants to invest in establishing IGF Plus. In a nutshell, what I would say IGF Plus is intended to be is the IGF, but plus more outcome orientation, more concrete support for policy-making processes, features like policy observatories, cooperation accelerators. These are all the jargony terms that are in the report, but the idea is that the IGF should be more than just a global process and series of events, that it should be more directed in its interventions and its support for policy making.
Thanks very much, Anriette, for that clarification.
Satish Babu, I would like
to Dr. Govind. You want to ask a question?
Thank you. Yeah.
Go
Thank
ahead.
you. Thank you, Anriette. My question is, you said excellently that data, environment, and trust are one of the major themes of this year's IGF. So how do these take the lead like data? How from this to next IGF, how we take the stock taking of this measure, where we reached intermediate stages, and in what countries have done what. So can we have a stock taking session where some of these issues can be how we measure that the implementation part of these things in various parts of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Govind, for that question. So those themes were developed last year in response to input from the community. Now, community is a term that I know one shouldn't use too loosely, but we use that term. Those are the stakeholders that are interested in the IGF. And then when there's an open call for input, they submit content. So those themes were nominated by the community, and we will again open it up. So you, for example, even the APSIG, if you wanted to do it as a collection, you can comment and say to us, these themes were not relevant, or yes, these themes are still relevant. Can you continue to work on them, but maybe work on them in a different way? So it is entirely up to the community. But I will say, Dr. Govind, because we're trying to be more focused in how the IGF produces outputs, we also want to try and be narrower, because there's a link. If the IGF covers too many themes and topics, it's very hard to come out with concrete suggestions or concrete proposals. So I think there's a general commitment to going narrower and deeper rather than broader and shallow.
Thanks, Anriette. I'm now going to read out a couple of questions from the chat window. Here's one from Jan Jacob. How do countries without SIGs or national IGF create a unified voice to represent their country aside the voice of nation-state entities?
And that's such an interesting question. I think that depends on the degree of goodwill and openness at a national process level. I think if a national IGF is one where everyone feels they are heard, if business doesn't feel that civil society dominates, or if civil society doesn't feel they are silenced, if government is willing to listen and talk, I think you can come up with a unified response on certain issues. But I think if there isn't that level of trust and collaboration at a national level between different stakeholders, then I think it's healthier to reflect the disagreement, to say, we talked about this topic and this topic, we agreed about topic 1, but on topic 2, we couldn't agree. Because I think that kind of honesty creates ultimately more trust and more confidence in policymaking. My view is that actually a national policymaking process where we can disagree with one another. I think India is actually a good example, where people are actively debating, is a healthier policy process than a national process where everyone pretends to agree. So it really depends on from country to country, and process to process, and topic to topic. Some topics are easier to build consensus around than others.
Thanks very much. And I'm aware that you're extremely busy today. So the last question for you. How do you foresee the global digital policymakers bridging the political divide over internet ecosystem differences to push for a unified global digital rights standard? How can it be done? And what role can APSIG play in this?
I think that's such a challenging question. I would like to think that if we can get global consensus on something simple, such as the internet is a public good, that it is managed and developed and run by different stakeholder groups. Some of it is run by government, some of the infrastructure is provided by the public sector, some is built by the private sector. The internet really is a multi-stakeholder entity. But if we can get consensus that it is a public good and that it should be managed as a public good, So it doesn't really matter who is active on the internet. What matters are the principles that underpin our policy and regulation of the internet. I think that could be a step that creates, a platform on which you can build more collaborative, common principles for internet governance. But I think we're still quite far away from that. So I think it's difficult. I think there are other areas where we can achieve consensus. And I think that is where existing international law and standards, such as international human rights law and standards, for example, apply to the internet. Because I think that we simply have to work to ensure that whether you're a company or a government, that you adhere to those international standards. And I think those include not just civil liberties, those include economic, cultural rights as well. For example, the rights to health, the rights to information about health, which is such an issue in the pandemic. And I think there it becomes very important. For example, a quick example before I go, from South Africa, our pandemic emergency law, the act that Parliament approved for the pandemic, included mandated zero rating of content that is run by universities, by schools, and by public health authorities. So university students did not have to pay data if they used their online learning platforms. The mobile operators didn't like this, but legislation actually mandated them to do this. And then they cooperated, they came to the table. So I think, that's an example of a very specific issue. But I think what works there is that you come up with a principle, a core principle, such as this is a pandemic, people need access to the internet, they can't afford the data, what do we do? And then you get the state and parliament to make an intervention, and then you build more participation with those that have to implement it.
Thanks very much. That is exceedingly interesting and informative. And we are now acutely aware of the challenges that exist in the internet ecosystem when we try to talk about governance. So once again, thank you very much for your time. And on behalf of all of us here, we would like to invite you to our sessions, every year, so that you can tell us what is the changes happening in the sector. Thanks again, and it's wonderful to have you.
Thanks, Satish. I would love to have been involved. We've got African IGF today, which is the reason that I cannot be with you for the whole day.
Right, thank you.
By the way, I'm very happy to respond to questions by email. Okay, so any further questions by email, just forward.
Right, thanks for that.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.